I bring this topic to you because yesterday we talked about enabling conditions for the wildlife economy, and two critical enabling conditions are the rule of law and socio-political stability. And in most countries in the world, those two things are achieved through various ways. But all of those ways are backstopped by force of arms. There's police forces, there's militaries, there's private security companies. And so I think the issue of security and the wildlife economy is an underexplored topic, and one that's part of my inquiry at the University of Oxford, where I'm examining a range of issues around the militarization of conservation. And we'll get to what that means in just a second, but a little bit about me. I am a PhD student at the University of Oxford. I'm also a research fellow here at AWEI. I serve on the board of advisors of the Game Rangers Association of Africa. And I'm also a conservation ambassador with DSC, which is a hunter-based conservation organization in the United States. In addition to these roles, I also am a member of the IUCN SULI and also a member of the Environmental Security and Conflict Law Specialist Group. Now, I tossed around this term militarization, and what does militarization mean? And what does it mean within the context of conservation and the wildlife economy? Well, if you've got an answer to that, I'd like to talk to you because that's one of the things that I'm examining as part of my PhD project. But generally speaking, when we talk about militarization and conservation, we're talking about the integration of strategies, tactics, and equipment traditionally reserved for warfighting into conservation programs. And this is a definition that I've developed. It's slightly more precise than what we see in the literature currently. Duffy and others have offered up a definition that's pretty broad, but when we consider that militaries perform a broad range of activities from delivering humanitarian aid to dropping nuclear weapons, there's a lot of daylight between those two things. And so when we're talking about the militarization of conservation and security in the wildlife economy, we really need to drill down a little bit more. So what we're talking about here is rangers carrying automatic weapons, the development of intelligence networks, the use of surveillance technology, things that are much more applicable to warfighting historically than they've been in the conservation space. Now, I would argue that security is today part of the wildlife economy. African governments are spending more and more money on arms and training and equipment. And this impacts the wildlife economy when we consider that park rangers are sister forces in some countries like Rwanda, DRC, South Sudan. There's also huge security expenditures by the private sector, particularly for high value species like rhinoceros. Then, of course, we've got foreign interests that are injecting money into the security concerns. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service spending an average of $6 million a year to support anti-poaching activities. And then massive investments that we don't have a number for with regard to NGOs. But you look at programs like 10 Boma in Kenya, which applies the technology that we use to find, fix, and finish terrorists in Iraq, being applied to anti-poaching. They're now bringing that to Zambia. These things are not cheap. These charts come from Francis Massey and Jared Margulis, but it just shows you the difference in spending that the Fish and Wildlife Service is putting into the wildlife economy. These orange lines that you see just spiking up is all about wildlife security, anti-poaching, counter-wildlife trafficking, research, human-wildlife conflict management, habitat conservation, much lower spending levels coming from just one agency in the US government. And when you consider that the State Department, the Department of Defense, the British Ministry of Defense, and other foreign actors are making similar investments, it's a significant amount of money that's flowing into Africa's wildlife economy. So the big research question that I see out there is, what is the economic value of providing security for wildlife assets, including the economic impact on local, national, and regional economies? Because all of this money that's being spent is jobs. It's spending on uniforms, equipment, petrol, et cetera. And then a related question to this is, how cost effective is this spending? Is this really what we should be spending our money on? Or is this just the sexy, thing that donors happen to like. You know, are there better ways to conserve wildlife than at the point of a gun? Now, whenever we pick up a weapon to solve a problem, it raises a host of ethical and practical concerns. Now, I'm not going to get into the ethical because that's way beyond my scope, but I am familiar with the practical. And I'm familiar with the practical because I should say I've got 20 years of experience working in both green militarization, which is looking at conservation issues through the lens of national security, and militarized conservation, which is the response to those concerns, helping train anti-poaching units here in Africa. Now, heavy-handed security measures can have unintended consequences. We've got research showing that when you go too far in providing security for wildlife, it can actually drive poaching. People do retaliatory killing because they don't like being treated poorly. Similarly, the fallout of heavy-handed security measures can cause retreat by donors and investors. You know, we saw this with the United States after a debacle with the World Wildlife Fund, where their rangers were involved in gross human rights abuses. Money was shut off for a period of time, which obviously had a conservation impact. So, you know, there does have to be care in pursuing this. Now, what does sustainable wildlife security look like? And I'd like to suggest two things for us to think about. You know, how do we get left of the kill, so to speak, so that force of arms remains a backstop to the enabling conditions and isn't the lead for conservation? Well, first, we have to make sure that the economic benefits from wildlife that accrue to local communities are sufficient enough to deter threats to that wildlife. You've got to make conservation pay more than poaching, basically. And then local communities should share in the security benefits provided by any type of wildlife security. They need to see armed rangers as protectors of them and not have this dynamic of rangers versus the community. Particularly in areas of, you know, what we call areas of low governance, where the police and the military and other first responders might be at quite a distance. So another big question for further research is, what are effective ways to integrate local communities into wildlife security? And what's the empirical evidence that we can gather to show that those ways are indeed effective? I want to thank you. If you want to get in touch with me, you can chat with me later this evening at the AWEI, or you can contact me at any of these places. Thank you.